the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali. It's Friday, January 23rd, 2015. What's behind the latest political violence in Bangladesh as dozens are killed and more than 7,000 arrested? We'll find out from Tania Rashid, international correspondent for Vice Media. And we'll go live to Montana to speak with Alexis Bonogofksy of the National Wildlife Federation, who lives near the Yellowstone River and will give us a report on the major oil spill that took place this week. Plus, Kiel of Propublica will share his latest investigative research on nonprofit hospitals and how they aggressively sue their poorest patients for unpaid bills. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Cristina Mislan. She's an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. Welcome, Cristina.
Hello, Sonali.
Saudi Arabia's 90-year-old King Abdullah has died. His brother, Crown Prince Salman, has been named his successor. The decades-long reign of a man seen as a moderate in his dealings with the West and a fundamentalist in his nation's imposition of Islamic law will likely remain in place. Controlling about a fifth of the world's oil reserves, Saudi Arabia has symbolized much about Western hypocrisy in its dealings with the Arab world. King Abdullah saw the Arab Spring movements for democracy as a threat to the stability of the Middle East and often acted to suppress them. Just south of the Saudi border in impoverished Yemen, a takeover by Shia militias called the Houthis has now resulted in the resignation of President Hadi, whose government received substantial support from Saudi Arabia. Cristina, how do you view King Abdullah's legacy in Saudi Arabia and how the U.S. has played along for all these years?
Well, at least in the West, Abdullah's legacy is being seen as one that has held on to more conservative, traditional practices and customs influenced by Islamic law. But at the same time, he's seen as someone who has introduced what the West would like to call some modern sensibilities. For instance, women could go to university alongside men. But and the fact that the U.S. Has played a long role in supporting Saudi Arabia and keeping it as an ally is not surprising, in that what I think might be interesting and could actually highlight some of these contradictions is, if we were to ask the U.S. government what its stance is on other issues dealing with women in Saudi Arabia. For instance, the U.S. often will use the oppression of women in the Middle East as a way to justify its impositions and its occupations, but at the same time, there's a different relationship that it has with Saudi Arabia. So I think maybe that conversation can actually help highlight some more of these contradictions, again, that we often see with U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East.
And then here in the United States, just hours after GOP House representatives killed their own bill banning all late-term abortions, they passed a watered-down version of the same bill yesterday. That bill, seen as a Plan B, calls for a ban of taxpayer money for abortions, all but ensuring that poor women have even less access to reproductive health care. Outside the halls of Congress, thousands of people rallied in an annual event dubbed the March for Life to mark the anniversary of the Supreme Court ruling in Roe versus Wade. The march's attendees, who want to see Roe overturned, were, according to news reports, dominated by young people this year. The March for Life is considered the largest anti-abortion event of the year, attracting people from all over the nation and world. Pro-choice activists also gathered, attempting to block marchers. Well, Cristina, given that the majority of the public remains pro-choice, are you disheartened by the GOP's moves?
I don't know if I'm disheartened. I'm definitely annoyed, and I guess I'm not disheartened because I'm not surprised, and this conversation comes up over and over again. But I think, it's interesting that the GOP's message is often about the government taking its hands off of the individuals that live in this. But at a time when it comes to an issue like abortion, they're really quick to then say, well, the government can determine what women do with their bodies. And so this contradiction has to be highlighted. And so my annoyance comes from something that we're not having this conversation, and we should be. Instead of a conversation about pro-life versus pro-choice, let's talk about this other message about this, what we're basically saying that women have to do or don't or can't do with their bodies.
And finally, a young journalist named Barrett Brown was just sentenced to 5 years in prison and an $890,000 fine for for the crime of posting a link to hacked material. The material was about Stratfor, an intelligence contractor, and was obtained by activist Jeremy Hammond, who is also imprisoned. Brown, who has written for The Guardian, Huffington Post, and others, had at one point been involved with the hacker collective Anonymous. He's already served 31 months in prison. Attempting to remain upbeat, he reacted to the harsh sentence, joking, quote, "The U.S. government decided today that because I did such a good job investigating the cyber-industrial complex, they're now going to send me to investigate the prison industrial complex." Meanwhile, in an interview with the New York Times, Andrew Lack, the head of the U.S. Broadcasting Board of Governors, cited a prominent news outlet, RT, as a challenge on the same level as Boko Haram and ISIS, simply because it reports statements by militant groups in its news. RT, which is a Russian-run English-language news site, said it was, quote, "extremely outraged at the comparison." Well, Cristina, are we hitting a low point for press freedom in the U.S. today?
Well, I don't know if it's lower than any other point, I guess, in U.S. history. For instance, we could look to Gary Webb and the issue with the Iran-Contra scandal to see that the U.S. has oppressed journalists in the past. But, you know, Jeremy Hill had a similar conversation on Democracy Now! Recently where he talked about exactly this, the contradictions that U.S. politicians, again, more contradictions. You know, U.S. politicians were in Paris promoting free speech and press freedom. But again, when it comes to maybe in the United States, they're not doing the same. And, you know, the issue about RT is funny because if we're going to put them on a list, then we should also put Fox News on that same list.
Right. Well, I want to thank you so much, Cristina, as always, for joining us today. Cristina Mislan is an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. You can now watch Uprising on Free Speech TV, which airs on Dish Network, Channel 9415, DirecTV Channel 348, and hundreds of part-time cable affiliates, and on Roku. Dozens of people have been killed and a whopping 7,000 arrested this week in Bangladesh as political unrest rocks the poor South Asian nation. On the first anniversary of the election that resulted in current Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina and her party, the Awami League, winning power, protests have been relentless. Hasina's government is facing serious opposition from the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, or BNP, which boycotted last year's election, and whose leader Khaleda Zia had until recently been placed under house arrest. Zia's son, Tariq Rahman, who is also a senior leader in the BNP, has been living in the UK since 2008 in exile. His speeches are currently banned in Bangladesh. A television owner who aired Rahman's speech in violation of the ban was arrested earlier this year. Thousands of police are in the streets of the capital, Dhaka, ostensibly to keep the peace, dealing with what Prime Minister Hasina has said amounts to terrorism rather than political activism. The government has also banned electronic communications programs to hamper activists' ability to organize. Amnesty International has condemned government violence and demanded justice for those killed. Over the past year since the controversial election results, about 100 people have been killed. Joining me in studio today is Tania Rashid. She is an international correspondent for Vice Media. Welcome to Uprising, Tania.
Hello.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, can you give our audience some background on these political figures, the two women in question, Sheikh Hasina and her rival Khaleda Zia? They've both been prime minister of the country at various times in the past. They're not new to the political scene. What is the main difference between these two candidates, these two rival political figures, politically and ideologically?
So with Sheikh Hasina, her party stands for secularism. I mean, both parties are quite similar, but with Sheikh Hasina, her stance is on a strong perspective of secularism, whereas Khaleda Zia's party has ties with the Jamaat-e-Islami, which is very popular Islamist party in Bangladesh. And what Sheikh Hasina claims is that her party is provoking a lot of violence in the streets because of their alliances with these Islamist organizations. And that is why her party people and the police officials have taken such a strong hold onto the streets.
And so the election that took place last January, are they seen across Bangladesh as illegitimate because they were boycotted? Or, is the country polarized in the same sort of sense that these two leaders are?
Well, 90% of the Bangladeshis live in the rural areas, and most of the people in the rural areas support the BNP, which is the opposition party. And with the elections, what Khaleda Zia wanted was a caretaker system to oversee the elections. And what had ended up happening was Sheikh Hasina took over and ignored her pleas to have a caretaker system, and essentially Khaleda Zia backed off and said she would boycott the elections. And yes, many people in the country, the sentiment is that it was completely unfair and biased, and that is why the protests have been happening this entire week.
What about Khaleda Zia's son Tariq Rahman? Why are his speeches banned? He's, as I understand, living in exile in the UK, and even there's even a danger considered by the current government of people in Bangladesh hearing what he has to say.
Well, the thing is, he criticizes the father of the nation, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. He's calling him a stooge and a razakar, which is someone who collaborated with Pakistan during the Liberation War, which is kind of outrageous.
And this father of the nation was Sheikh Hasina's father.
Yes.
So she comes from a political dynasty that is very well established.
And his father, Tariq Rahman's father, was actually a major military leader during the Liberation War. And he claims that his father was the leader of the movement for Bangladesh, which is actually factually incorrect. And he's also been banned from coming into Bangladesh due to some corruption charges. And I think the government fears that because of his outrageous claims about Sheikh Mujibur Rahman could provoke even more violence throughout the country.
How is the current government using the issue of instability and also this tagline, which has become so popular the world over now, of terrorism as an excuse to crack down on protest?
I think it is being used as an excuse, and in some ways, the current government is acting as a dictatorship. And yes, they are not giving a voice to the opposition party, which shows that there's some kind of fear that they can take over and do something because there is such a strong BNP alliance throughout the country.
I mean, to arrest 7,000 plus people in one sort of week-long sweep, that's remarkable. I mean, that's a huge number.
Well, they've been arresting people off and on for a long time now, ever since the elections, and it's just what they do, and they won't give the opposition party a voice and a stance to speak their mind. And Khaleda Zia was locked in her house for a week.
Right.
And this happened in the previous elections, too. It's the same thing happening all over again.
Right. So the opposition leader placed under house arrest. She was just released. Let's talk about the fact that people's ability to communicate is also being impacted. I mentioned there were essentially some popular apps that have been now banned that people use to communicate with one another. Those are, and the head of a TV station that dared to air Tariq Rahman's speech has also been arrested. Is there also a major crackdown on press freedom?
Well, journalists have been facing a lot of things throughout the country, and my stance on that is it's hard to say because Twitter is still functioning, Facebook is still functioning. I think it has something to do with the mobile applications and people not using cell phones as frequently. But there's definitely some issues with press freedom, like David Bergman. He's a prominent journalist there, and he had criticized the war crimes tribunals, and that had led him into a lot of trouble. So there's definitely a certain amount of thing you can say, and then if you say too much, then you get in trouble, and people come after you.
How are people ordinary Bangladeshis using social media? I mean, this is one of the poorest nations in the world, and in South Asia, certainly one of the poorest. How are people able to access social media, and how are they using it to communicate with one another?
People use Facebook. all the time. Everybody's on Facebook, and there's a lot of political commentary happening on Facebook. And it's mostly the middle class population that's using the internet. And there are also lots of internet cafes that people go into. And you have to think it's a very densely populated country. So the only way people can really communicate is by going online. It's kind of an outlet for the youth.
So there's also been, I understand, somewhat of a transport strike that Khaleda Zia, the opposition leader, has been encouraging, which has tremendously impacted the country's major international export, which is, of course, the garment industry. Bangladesh has long been the focus of international labor activism for the poor working conditions of people who make clothing for many of us in the West here. And the current government has criticized this, saying that you're basically making Bangladesh look really bad to the rest of the world. Can you comment on that?
Well, the thing is that the hortals, which are these protests that are happening, happen all the time throughout the country. And sometimes even the current government in power calls for these protests. Right. And so
it's essentially a general strike, and where everything goes to a standstill.
Everything gets shut down. And of course, it affects the economy because the garments industry is one of the main sources of income for the country to survive. And so not only does the industry get affected, but the workers get affected, and they make less than $1 a day. So they're not able to go to work. And they have the risk of a bus exploding and them being inside of it. So what do they do?
And so and of course, the backdrop to all of this for those of us in the West who've paid attention to Bangladesh has been the major labor concerns in Bangladesh. We've had in the past few years whole buildings collapsing, killing hundreds of mostly young girls who've worked in these factories. Is that a political issue within Bangladesh, the working conditions? I mean, their unions are quite strong for certain sectors, and we've been in touch with one of our contacts on the ground there for political comment, who said that she couldn't speak up about the political situation between the two leaders because their job as it is difficult and there would be a serious crackdown. So she has to remain quiet on this issue.
I covered the factory collapse from the moment it happened for Al Jazeera English, and it was one of the most horrific incidents I had ever seen in my life. Saying that there is a major issue with saying you're aligned with a specific political party, that creates more risks for union leaders, and many have been arrested and held hostage and even beaten for speaking up against certain things the government is doing. So in some ways, I hate to say this, but the current government is kind of like a military, like a dictatorship.
So let's also talk about the U.S. role here. Of course, there are corporate ties between the U.S. and Bangladesh in terms of the garment industry, but can U.S. aid to Bangladesh be predicated on the government respecting human rights? Amnesty International has called for the government to respect human rights, and of course, the U.S. using aid as leverage is never necessarily something to be encouraged. But in this situation, is it any kind of lever that can be used as a sort of last resort?
During the factory collapse, the U.S. had offered aid, and Deepu Muni, the then minister, had declined any offers, saying that the government was taking care of it and they were fine all by themselves. But in reality, what happens is that there are people from all walks of life coming together to take care of a situation that is hardly manageable. And that's kind of been Bangladesh's stance. I've noticed after working there for a few years is, no, we don't need your help. We could handle it on our own.
And this is essentially coming from the government.
Yes.
What do you think is going to happen in the next few months and years with respect to the political situation? And is there a sort of stranglehold on politics by these political figures and dynasties that ordinary Bangladeshis maybe caught in the middle are trying to break through? Or is there, as you mentioned earlier, overwhelming support for one side over another?
Well, the thing is that I think the violence and political instability is going to continue throughout the country. And the thing with the Awami League is they want to remain in power, and they will do everything and anything it takes to stay that way. But the BNP, with the stronghold they're having over the BNP, it is highly likely, I mean, this is from my personal perspective, that BNP could be taken over because they control everything that's happening now, and essentially they don't have a voice.
Right. Well, before we close, I want to ask you about a piece that you just wrote for Vice magazine about a little-known industry inside Bangladesh that is not unionized, and that's Bangladesh's tanneries, basically these factories where workers work in very harsh conditions tanning leather. Tell us a little bit about the environment that these workers work in, how big this industry is, and what recourse they have.
Well, it's $1 billion industry. So all the fashionable purses and shoes that people are wearing in the West are made by people, a lot of the people, workers in Bangladesh. And these workers work with their bare hands and bare feet and are exposed to very hazardous chemicals that, cause cancer, among other diseases. And it's not just the workers, but it's also the people who live in the surrounding areas. They are exposed to these hazardous chemicals because they're then dumped into the local areas. So it's not just the chemicals, it's the cow hides, the rotting leather. It's a very, very unfortunate situation, because if that much money is being made off of those purses, why can't the workers have the basic, gloves and basic protection gear to make the stuff for the West?
And so many of them have to remain continuously on medication in order to not fall apart physically.
Which is kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because when they're taking this steroid cream, the doctors say, from some of the people I had interviewed, that if you keep putting this cream and you're working, it's just going to get worse and worse. You essentially have to stop working in these hazardous environments. But a lot of the people in Bangladesh, they're very poor. And these workers only make less than $5 a day. And they have to survive. And every single person I interviewed and asked, why are you working in these hazardous conditions? They tell me, I have to survive. I have kids to feed.
And how big is this industry? How many people work in it?
There are over 1,500 workers.
1,500.
And there are over 250 factories.
And so there's no oversight of this, and why aren't some of the major unions that represent garment work that trying to represent garment workers and organize for them, including this group?
That's a very interesting question. That's something I have addressed. And what happens is there's been a lot of scrutiny from the government. And there have been attempts to unionize, but that has been blocked from them from happening.
Right. Earlier you pointed out the difference between the two major parties, the Awami League, which is in power now, and the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, in terms of one being secular and the other Islamist. Is there a difference in economic ideology?
No, they're very similar.
Right.
They're very similar and extremely corrupt. Both parties are very corrupt, and they have loads of corruption charges throughout the years that continue to persist today.
Even murder charges. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us, Tania. Where's the best place where readers can read your writing? Where our audience can read?
I'm actually also a video journalist, and I have some documentaries that can be found on Vice Media. And I have some shows coming out on Vice on HBO. So stay tuned for that.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
And thank you so much, Tania, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
My guest, Tania Rashid, is an international correspondent for Vice Media. We've been talking about the ongoing political violence in Bangladesh. This is Uprising. When we come back, we'll go to Montana to find out about a major oil spill in the Yellowstone River. It's the second one in just a few years. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. You can now watch Uprising online at our YouTube channel. That's at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. Please do subscribe. 50,000 gallons of crude oil have spilled into the Yellowstone River near the farming town of Glendive in Montana. It's the second time in 4 years that such a spill has occurred. The spill came from an oil pipeline that goes under the Yellowstone, and in the immediate aftermath of the spill that happened earlier this week, Montana state officials and the Environmental Protection Agency deemed drinking water supplies safe. But then residents complained about the smell of gas, and tests revealed the presence of benzene, a carcinogen, in the water. The state is now trucking in thousands of gallons of bottled water to Glendive's approximately 6,000 residents. Montana Governor Steve Bullock has declared a state of emergency as cleanup crews work navigating the treacherously icy areas of the river. The pipeline is owned and operated by Bridger Pipeline, which is pledged to pay for the cleanup. In July 2011, an ExxonMobil pipeline spilled more than 60,000 gallons of crude into the same river, affecting a different community around the same area. Now, fears abound over the planned Keystone XL pipeline, which, if built, would also cross the Yellowstone River. The House of Representatives has already passed a bill approving the pipeline, and a vote is likely to happen soon in the Senate. President Obama has promised to veto approval. My guest is Alexis Bonogofksy. She's with the National Wildlife Federation and lives near the Yellowstone. She was impacted by the earlier spill in 2011. Alexis, welcome to Uprising.
Thank you.
Well, can you tell us how this spill has impacted communities near where you live directly? It's just been a few days now, and aside from the drinking water issue, how are people's lives being impacted?
Well, the drinking water contamination is probably the most major immediate impact that people have experienced. Right now, because the river is iced over, a lot of the oil is just stuck. It's basically stuck in the river underneath the ice. It's starting to pool in certain areas. So impacts to the land haven't happened yet, but if there's flooding, if the ice breaks up, if there's ice jams and we see flooding, that's when we might see the oil come over the banks, but we won't know. They haven't been able to recover hardly any of the oil because of the ice. And really, like, once the oil is out, the oil is out.
Now, this is not obviously the first time this has happened. Are there folks going, oh gosh, not again? You were impacted personally by the 2011 spill. Can you tell us about that spill?
Yeah, so in July of 2011, I walked down to our hayfields. We have a farm on the Yellowstone River south of Billings, and we had heard that the river was supposed to crest, come over the banks, and I walked down to see if it had that morning. And our pastures, our hayfields they were flooded, and I walked down and there was oil everywhere. We were not evacuated from my farm. We never got a call from anyone. The sheriff didn't come to our house, and so that was the first that we had known about it. It was devastating. I don't know how to describe how awful it was. It was months and months of dealing with, the smell of oil, cleanup workers on our place, water testing, air quality testing, all of these things. And we had to move we raise goats, and we had to move all of the goats basically off of the river into this small pen up by my house. It was awful. And I think people, they get complacent. Like, we had a bunch of media, we had a bunch of people here saying we need safer pipelines, we need to check these pipelines. And then 3.5 years later, it happens again. It's just downstream from me. And they keep saying there's lessons learned, but we don't seem to learn them.
What technology, as far as you know, can they use for the cleanup, or are they using for the cleanup? I mean, you mentioned that a lot of the oil is stuck right now, and in the past, often companies have used oil dispersants, which simply break up the oil into smaller bits so that they're less visible, and that makes the contamination even worse. Is that what they're looking into right now?
I don't believe that the dispersants is being used on the river. Usually in flooding, or usually if there's an oil spill up here in Montana in rivers, the river will just flush away the oil. It's basically, in the industry, the solution to pollution is dilution. That's what they say.
Oh, wow.
Dispersants here wouldn't do anything, basically, because all the oil is just stuck under the ice, and a lot of it is already downstream. During the 2011 oil spill on my farm, basically they had these booms, these sort of absorbent booms that stop the oil, because the oil usually comes to the top of the water. And then these like little kind of napkin-like things. I mean, the technology is not high tech. It's, they don't, and that's why I say, I mean, once the oil's out of the pipeline, it's basically out. They don't hardly recover any of it.
Right. You mentioned these sort of napkins. There's images of cleanup crews with these large, look like sheets of thick white paper that they
Yeah,
can lay over the
yeah,
surface to absorb it and then presumably dispose of it. Not very
yeah,
high tech at all.
no.
The drinking water supplies are deep under the Yellowstone River, I understand, and initially authorities assumed that the water would be safe, and then they realized it was contaminated because people could actually smell it. So I mean, was there testing done initially, or they just assumed that it was safe until people complained?
They they just assumed it was safe. They
Wow.
said it was 14 feet underneath the intake for the drinking water, 14 feet underneath the surface. They say oil comes to the surface, so there's no way the oil can get into the water system. When everyone who has an inkling of common sense knows that when the river is iced over, water is moving quickly underneath the ice. It's churning because, the Yellowstone River is a fast moving, there's a lot of water there. It's churning and the intake is sucking water in. So, of course, oil is going to get in there. Glendive Department of Emergency Services did not have the testing capabilities that they needed to test for hydrocarbons in the water. And so people were basically drinking water with benzene in it for about 2 days. Wow. before water started to get trucked in.
So there's now, and of course, in the meantime, before the water that was being trucked in could reach people, there were reports of elderly people being unable to take their medication. How serious had the situation been earlier this week?
From what I've heard from people, it was pretty serious. I mean, there are a lot of people who were not mobile enough to go down to the grocery store to get bottled water. I haven't talked to anyone this morning, but I think that there were people who were seriously scared. I mean, when you don't have access to water, that's sort of a basic human need, obviously, and when you don't have that, that's serious. And the fact that the fact that for 2 days people were saying, I smell oil in my water, and our officials were saying, oh no, that is impossible, that couldn't have happened. It's ridiculous.
Have you been given any kind of a timeline for the cleanup of the water supply? How are they planning on dealing with this? I mean, as you said, if the solution is dilution, are they just hoping that there'll just be less and less benzene in the water supply, at which point they'll say, all right, there's just so little parts per million that it's now safe to drink?
Yeah, so apparently this morning they've basically purged their water treatment of all of the water that was in there with the benzene. They're asking residents to flush out their systems. There was a public meeting last night in Glendive where they went through the steps of how to do this. They think that drinking water will be safe today. They did get tests back, and I think I wrote this. Yeah, so on Monday the benzene was 15 parts per billion, and today it is 0.83 parts per billion. Before the oil spill, though, it was 0.03 parts per billion. So it's elevated, it's higher than it was before the oil spill, but they say it's safe. That's what the EPA is telling them.
Now, Alexis, do you have any sense of why this pipeline spill occurred?
Well, officials haven't come out with an official reason. We had to wait for a long time in 2011 to know exactly what happened. Supposedly, the pipeline was about 8 feet underneath the river. It did break in the river. We know that for sure. My hunch, and I don't, this is just what I've researched ever since the 2011 oil spill. I've sort of done a lot of homework on pipelines. And what I think probably happened is either the river bottom scoured, which means like if, with flooding and ice and all this stuff, basically it can erode the top layer, and then maybe something hit it and it broke, or the pipeline, it's an old pipeline, so maybe it just failed.
And what do you make of the response by Bridger Pipeline, which is the company that owns this? In 2011, it was an ExxonMobil spill. And how have they said that they're going to deal with it? And based on your experience with ExxonMobil 4 years ago, do you believe them?
All the oil companies will say, we're here, we're going to pay for everything, we'll make this right. They all say that at the beginning. Usually what happens is once the media attention dies down, you see less and less response from them. from what I've heard from people in Glendive, they've been fairly good. They've been maybe even more responsive than some of the elected officials and agency people. But you know, they're an oil company. I mean, they are going to probably try and do it the cheapest way they can. At some level, you know, the oil's already in the river. You know, in 2011, what I found was that a lot of the cleanup activity, I mean, ExxonMobil spent $135 million here on the river, but a lot of the cleanup activity seemed just, you, there's not much you can do once the oil's out there. So it's just, it's not for show, but it's really, it's minimal. You like your impact of cleaning up the oil gets less and less the further away you get from the spill.
What about state officials and the governor? The governor has declared a state of emergency. Do you see the government officials as being on your side, or essentially looking at these private companies as partners?
That's been my main issue for the last 3.5 years is that most of the time what we find is our government agencies are, it seems like them and the oil companies are together against the public. Like the public always feels like we're a burden to the agencies. I feel like 2011, our state of Montana government really stepped up. They did a great job. I always think back then they did what they could for the landowners. I'm really disappointed in how the state is handling this oil spill. It almost seems like they forgot everything they learned in 2011. It's really frustrating for a member of the public when you are like in a public meeting and you see the EPA, the oil company, and your state government sitting up there basically telling you everything is going to be okay when it's not. And they, you know, they're very protective of each other. And it's frustrating. And unless the public speaks out, you know, they will continue to do so.
Well, Alexis, how vulnerable are pipelines in general to spills, since you've done a lot of homework on this issue? And in that sense, what is the implication for the Keystone XL pipeline, whose plan is to also cross the Yellowstone River?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you know, researching pipelines for a long time, it's sort of, you know, pipelines will break. There's always failures. You know, we can't, it's not every pipeline is going to break, but pipelines break. The Keystone is scary for a lot of us in Montana. The Yellowstone River is extremely important for agriculture, extremely important for recreation. It's extremely important to our economy. That pipeline is not worth the risk of a potential break into the river. It would devastate, I mean, it would devastate our economy, agriculture. I mean,
but jobs, right? That's what they say, jobs. I mean, every time you bring up this argument, but jobs, it's going to create jobs. And yet Republicans in the House stripped away requirements that any jobs created from this pipeline would have to be in the U.S. and that the oil generated would have to be used in the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, in Montana, we have one of the lowest unemployment rates in the country. We don't need, I mean, this jobs argument is ridiculous. Like, we have people in Billings that can't find people to work for them. I mean, that jobs argument, we wouldn't have people working on this pipeline in Montana. I mean, for the construction, but then it would be done, and we would have to bring in workers from out of state. They wouldn't hire people from Montana. Yeah.
Finally, I want to thank you. Before I thank you, Alexis, what do you want for our audience to know about this issue? Where can they read about it after the cameras have gone away, after the news fades? Are you blogging about it? Are there independent sources of information?
Yeah, I will definitely be writing about this. I have a website called eastofbillings.com, and that's Billings is with 2 L's. I write about Eastern Montana issues because a lot of times that is ignored. And I will be continuing to write about this online, and I hope people, you know, just pay attention to this sort of stuff, because the residents there, they're going to be dealing with this for years after this spill.
That's eastofbillings.com. Alexis, I want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Alexis Bonogofksy is with the National Wildlife Federation, and she lives near the Yellowstone River in eastern Montana. She was personally affected by the 2011 spill. A new spill happened just earlier this week that has impacted about 6,000 people in Glendive. This is Uprising. When we come back, We'll take a look at a new study, a new research done by ProPublica in collaboration with NPR about nonprofit hospitals and how they prey on their poorest patients. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. A new investigative report by ProPublica and NPR has found that some nonprofit hospitals in the U.S., in order to recoup unpaid bills, are suing their poorest patients, often garnishing their already meager paychecks and charging exorbitant interest rates. A case study in Missouri of a nonprofit hospital called Heartland is a particularly egregious example of the practice. Heartland, it was found, has its own for-profit debt collection agency called Northwest Financial Services, which in turn has sued thousands of patients, collecting millions of dollars from their paychecks. Strangely, Heartland, which is the only hospital in St. Joseph County, Missouri, is flush with cash, having made $45 million in profit last year alone. Only a very small fraction of the hospital's income is generated from suing delinquent patients. Because it is a nonprofit organization, Heartland does not pay income taxes or property taxes and is expected, because of this status, to serve low-income patients. Uninsured folks who are slapped with tens of thousands of dollars of medical bills they cannot pay are left penniless when such hospitals take them to court and garnish their wages. My guest is Paul Kiel. He covers consumer finance for ProPublica and has led the investigation into nonprofit hospitals. Welcome to Uprising, Paul.
Thank you.
Well, first, explain exactly how it works. Essentially, do all hospitals have their own sort of debt collection agency, or was this one sort of unique in that? And if they don't have their own debt collection agency, do they work with others in terms of how these hospitals try to recoup costs?
We didn't get the sense that nonprofit hospitals having their own for-profit debt collection agency was a common thing. Mm-hmm. However, a nonprofit hospital referring a debt to a debt collector, I think, is fairly common. But this was I think, particularly egregious instance. I mean, we had the benefit of having court data for the entire state of Missouri, so we targeted this hospital because they just jumped out of the data. Like, why is this one hospital? Once we determined that this debt collector was owned by this hospital, why is this hospital suing so many people? More than like these enormous hospitals in St. Louis or Kansas City. They're in this little town in the corner of the state, 80,000 people in St. Joseph. It's the only hospital in town. So that was the reason we focused on this hospital. But on the other hand, we found hospitals elsewhere in Missouri, other Midwestern states in the South doing the same type of thing. So, it's an extraordinary case, but also one that I think is indicative of a broader problem.
Now, you profiled a couple named Tammy and Keith Berry who've used the hospital several times for medical emergencies. They're uninsured. Can you share with us their story as an example of what others go through?
Sure. So right now, I believe they have a grown child, so they don't qualify for Medicaid. Tammy works at basically Taco John's, which is like the Midwestern Taco Bell, I found out, making a little over $8 an hour. And, for various things, they don't have health insurance, so if she gets pneumonia, they have to go to the hospital. And on at least 2 occasions, they've been sued by the hospital over large debts, and we're talking, $5,000 to $10,000 type debts that are completely beyond their financial means. And Tammy Berry has had her wages garnished over the last 5 years.
Her wages are $8.20 an hour, and they're taking money out of that kind of a paycheck?
Yeah, I mean, federal law. The federal law for wage garnishment was set way back in the 1960s. It hasn't been updated since then. And basically what it says is that if you earn more than 30 times the minimum wage, which comes out to roughly like $217 a week, you can have your wages garnished. So you have people earning very, very low wages who are still not poor enough to avoid wage garnishment. And you have a really perverse outcome sometimes when you have someone like her who's earning like just over $8 an hour. She still has money taken out of her paycheck, so she ends up with wages that are effect below the minimum wage after you account for the wage garnishment.
Now, what about the fact that the hospital in question does, and many hospitals do have these sorts of programs that low-income people can qualify for to either get low-cost services or, in some cases, entirely free services? Wouldn't the Berries have qualified for that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think a big piece of context, and I think something that people often don't realize is that most of the hospitals in this country are nonprofits. They're supposed to be charitable institutions. They are expected to provide a community benefit. They're expected to provide care for people who can't afford it. All of them are supposed to have a financial assistance policy, which lays out, what type of income below, what threshold do you qualify for our program. The program that this hospital has seems pretty reasonable on its face. If you earn below twice the poverty line, then you are eligible for free care, and then even up to three times the poverty line, you can get a major reduction in your cost. So the Berries are very comfortably below that, so they should have qualified. But what has happened a lot over the years is that you have a policy that on paper looks great, but the patients don't hear about it, or if something is said about financial assistance, they don't realize that they're being essentially told, you could have your entire bill wiped out. They don't understand that. So they end up with their wages garnished sometimes for years when it was completely unnecessary, because they should have, gotten basically the whole bill written off.
Now, Paul, I noticed that one of the things that you found when you confronted hospital officials with this, the fact that these patients that they're garnishing wages from could have qualified for free or low-cost health care, their answer seemed to suggest that if the patients are unaware, it's their fault. In one piece, you quoted a hospital spokesperson, Tracy Clark, who said, charity care is reserved for patients who, quote, seek it and legitimately work with us. But shouldn't the hospital inform all patients clearly that they could qualify for assistance? I mean, if not, they're essentially operating on a basis that sounds like fraud.
Yeah, that's then the major problem, is that you have something like, oh, well, we put a sign up, or, we gave, in the papers that we gave people when they signed up, there was some mention of it, or we put a line at the bottom of the billing statements, things like this. And, if you tell someone clearly, your whole bill is going to be written off if you can just show us what your income is. People understand that. Mm-hmm. But instead what happens is you have some gibberish about financial assistance and thresholds of like federal poverty guidelines. And, normal people often don't know what that means. So unless some sort of advocate gets involved, like a legal services person or like some sort of counselor, and helps them explain, what is actually happening to them, oftentimes people can fall through the cracks. So one positive thing that has happened is that in the Affordable Care Act in 2010, there was a provision that started a process that at least set some basic requirements for what hospitals have to do to publicize their policy. And recently the IRS issued final guidelines for that. So within the next years, that should be in effect. And basically what they require are everyone has to receive something at the hospital, a piece of paper that clearly explains the financial assistance policy. They have to get some verbal, conversation about it. If the hospital starts going down the road of being aggressive with debt collection, like reporting a debt to the debt credit agencies, or even garnishing wages, there have to be like notices. And so now there's at least some sort of baseline of things they have to do.
Right.
There's still a fear that people could fall through the cracks if a hospital is not being, proactive about it. But one thing we do show in the story is like not all hospitals do this. There are hospitals that do take affirmative steps that, for instance, you can look at where the person lives or what type of job they have and make a pretty good assumption that this is someone who, is not earning a lot of money, and then treat them on that basis. and sort of assume that they probably would qualify, even if for whatever reason you can't get all the paperwork you need. And then, treat them differently. Don't go after them in the same way you would go after someone who you think has the means to pay.
Now, one spokesperson said, quote, "It's not fair to those who are paying to not be aggressive with those who have the ability and aren't paying." But, of course, the uninsured patients, like the Berries, didn't have the ability to pay. And also, they're getting slapped with the highest possible interest rate on their debt, which in Missouri is 9%. The courts are also involved in this. Why are the courts also being so heartless? Don't judges who come to these decisions that it's okay to garnish wages from someone barely earning above the minimum wage, that is entirely unethical?
Well, I mean, I'm somewhat sympathetic to judges in that they're there to uphold the law, and if the laws are unconscionable, that's sometimes you have a judge rule that this is unconscionable, and then they get overturned on the appeals. So you have a law that severely disadvantages people, and 9%. There's no justification for that. I believe it's an interest rate that goes back to a time when interest rates were much higher, like in the early '80s. There's no reason for an interest rate on a debt to appreciate beyond inflation, which should be about 2%. But you have a whole system that's set up that makes it very easy for debt collectors to go after people. And not just this hospital, but debt collectors in general. I mean, I've been doing a lot of reporting on the court system. And kind of the attitude is, we'll sue people if they have the means to pay. And then it becomes evident that their definition of what it means for someone to have the means to pay is that they have a paycheck.
Wow.
Essentially, there's something for us to go. They're above the garnishable level. We won't go after people on Social Security because that's illegal under federal law. But if you have money for us to take, we're going to take it, essentially.
So doesn't being sued for medical bills also impact your entire financial situation, because it lowers your credit rating? It can lower or weaken your ability to rewrite your mortgage, to do all sorts of other things that you might be trying to do to keep your head above water to begin with.
Yeah, there's all sorts of knock-on effects. Not just from being sued, but even from having a debt that's a big medical debt being reported to the credit agencies, and that the interest rate you can get on a car loan, interest rate you can get on a mortgage, even credit cards, all those go up, and so you can obviously see knock-on effects. Maybe we didn't mention this in the story, but one of these guys in the story we reported on, he has something like over $25,000 in debt. He has basically no consumer debt, but he can't qualify for a credit card because his credit's ruined. So he's forced to go to, high-cost lenders like installment lenders, where he's paying like 90% interest.
Wow.
And it's a domino effect that, and that's another area where there might be some positive developments, because the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has been kind of on a campaign to see medical debts treated differently from other consumer debts, because oftentimes they'll end up on your credit report and maybe you don't even know that you owe this debt, or some mix up with your insurer and the medical provider. So there's a lot of good basis for treating those types of debts differently.
Right.
So that's one thing. Yeah.
And medical debt has been one of the leading causes of bankruptcy in the United States, which fits into the larger issue of our poor insurance industry and terrible access to healthcare. You brought up Medicaid earlier, and isn't Medicaid supposed to cover the poorest among us? And of course, the Affordable Care Act was supposed to fix some of this. But is there also an issue of state politics that's involved?
Yeah, I mean, I did this story about Missouri, where the expansion hasn't taken place because you have a Republican legislature that doesn't want to do it.
Yeah.
So that would make a big difference for the poorest people who are just around the poverty line. They would be covered by Medicaid if they expanded in the state. I did another story about a public hospital in Alabama where the Medicaid levels, basically, if you have any income, you don't qualify. And they didn't expand it there too. So there are certain things there that if states, like Medicaid expansion is a big problem, because it's something I haven't heard a good public policy reason not to expand it, and it has an enormous effect for hundreds of thousands of people.
What about Republican Senator Chuck Grassley, who has seen your story and who I understand wrote a letter to Heartland Hospital? And has he taken any steps to try to remedy the situation?
Yeah, he's been very good on the issue for a long time. Back a decade, he started an investigation of what hospitals were doing to merit their tax exemptions, and he's actually the one that co-authored the language in the Affordable Care Act that at least begins to set some standards for this. And he did send a letter to this hospital in Missouri, which not only hopefully will lead to a change of policy at this one hospital, but will send a message to other hospitals that are still doing this type of thing, that it's not acceptable, and maybe they don't want the committee chairman of the Judiciary Committee to be breathing down their neck. That's kind of his hope. I would
Right.
So hopefully this leads to more change. I mean, things have improved over time. Certain states in the last 10, 15 years have passed reforms that, for instance, Illinois has a kind of a basic requirement for hospitals providing charity care or care, reduced cost care to poor patients. There are definitely things that can take place at the state level that make this much harder to happen.
And
but a lot, yeah.
Finally, Paul, has Heartland itself, which by the way is now renamed Mosaic Life Care, has it responded directly to your investigation?
Yeah, I mean, we were very close conversation with them during the investigation, and afterwards they said that they were reviewing their practices, and recently they told us they expect their first recommendations of that review to come out in the next month. So, it's a sort of thing where they clearly, when we were interviewing them, they're like, yeah, there's been some stories in our local media about this, like the fact that we're suing thousands of people, but it's not really a story. But I think having this sort of magnifying glass on them
Right.
has finally, hopefully, led them to conclude that it's not acceptable.
What will happen to Tammy and Keith Berry?
Well, I think hopefully the review of the practices by the hospital will lead to an improvement. I think for now her check is still being garnished. So,
Well, Paul, I want to thank you very much for joining us. We'll post a link to your story from our website, uprisingwithsonali.com, later today. Thanks so much.
thanks.
Paul Kiel is my guest. He covers consumer finance for ProPublica, and the research that he's just done was done in collaboration with NPR. And that does it for our program. This is Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our senior producer. Anna Buss is our assistant producer. Alexander Holmes is our technical director. Christian Beck is our production assistant. Camilo Ramirez is our audio editor. Teddy Robinson and Jonathan Alexander are our audio engineers. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprisingwithsonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. Have a wonderful weekend. I'll see you Monday.